Jürgen Habermas, 1929 to 1926, Communication, Courage and the Ethics of the Public Intellectual. Hello everyone. Today I want to speak about the death of a philosopher who shaped the intellectual life of the 20th and early 21st century, more than anyone else. Jürgen Habermas died yesterday at the age of 96. For many people outside of academic circles, his name might not immediately resonate, but for those of us who've spent our lives thinking about democracy, power, communication and education, Habermas was a towering figure. He was one of the last great public intellectuals of the European tradition, a philosopher who did not simply write for academic journals, but who intervened repeatedly in the public life of his society. Habermas wrote about democracy, the public sphere, modernity, and the dangers of power when it becomes hidden within institutions. But at the heart of his work was something surprisingly simple: the idea that humans must be able to talk to each other, not manipulate each other, not manage each other, not persuade each other through power, but genuinely speak and genuinely listen. To understand Habermas, we have to remember the generation he belonged to. He was born in Germany in 1929. This meant his childhood unfolded entirely under the Nazi regime. Like many young Germans, he grew up within an ideological system that shaped everything around him: education, culture, politics, even language itself. At the age of 16, near the end of the war, he was mobilized to help operate anti-aircraft guns. Like many young people at that time, he had believed that what he had been taught was the truth, and then, very suddenly, his world collapsed. The end of that war brought devastation to Germany, but it also brought something else: a moral reckoning. During the process of denazification, young Germans began to confront the horrifying reality of the regime they had grown up within. For Habermas, this experience became foundational. Much of his life's work can be understood as an attempt to explain how modern societies fall into systems of domination and how democratic societies must resist them. Habermas's most famous idea is known as communicative action. The idea is really quite intuitive. He argued that human beings interact in two fundamentally different ways. Sometimes we act strategically. We try to achieve goals, we persuade, we influence and manipulate, but sometimes we act creatively. When we do that, language serves a different purpose. Not control, not success, but understanding. Communicative action is when people speak to each other in order to reach shared understanding of the world they inhabit together. For Habermas, this was the ethical foundation of democracy. Democracy is not simply voting. It is the ability of citizens to deliberate, argue, question, and act together. Without communication, democracy becomes hollow. One of Habermas's most influential ideas is his distinction between what he called life world and system. The life world is the space of everyday human experience: family, culture, education, conversation, shared meaning. It is the world where people encounter each other directly. But modern societies also contain systems, markets, bureaucracies, administrative systems. These systems operate through money, power, and instrumental rationality. They are necessary for organizing complex societies, but Habermas warned that something dangerous can happen. The system can begin to colonize the life world. In other words, bureaucratic logic and economic logic can begin to shape spaces where human meaning and communication should flourish. Language becomes managerial, education becomes administrative, citizens become consumers. This was one of Habermas's deepest concerns. So why did Habermas matter to me? Well, he's been very important in my intellectual journey. When I began writing about educational leadership many years ago, I found that much of our field was dominated by managerial language. Efficiency, performance, effectiveness, productivity, success. These ideas come from business and administration, but education is not a factory. It is a human relationship, and Habermas helped me to articulate why this matters. In one of my earlier academic papers, I said that educational leadership theory often privileges what Habermas would call strategic action, success-oriented behavior, rather than communicative action. Strategic action uses language as a tool of influence. Communicative action uses language to build understanding. Education, at its best, must belong to the second category, because teaching is fundamentally communicative. It's about dialogue between teachers and students, between schools and communities, between generations. When educational leadership becomes dominated by managerial thinking, that communicative core begins to disappear. Habermas gave us language to understand that problem. This has a personal resonance for me. There's also something much more in it for me here, because Habermas was born with a cleft lip and palate, and as a child this affected his speech significantly. Growing up with a communication difficulty inevitably shapes the way a person sees the world. My younger brother was born with the same condition in the 1970s. I remember the hospital visits, the operations, the long recoveries. Much of it took place at Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. We grew up in a small fishing village in Cornwall, in community. Differences can sometimes be difficult for children. Speech difficulties especially. Communication becomes something fragile, something that cannot be taken for granted. So when Habermas wrote about communication as the ethical foundation of human society, I think he was speaking from a very deep personal understanding. Communication is not just technical, it is human recognition. Habermas was not simply a philosopher in the academic sense. He was also a public intellectual. Throughout his life, he intervened in debates in German history, European democracy, migration, war, and the future of Europe. One of the most famous examples was the Historikerstreit in the 1980s, the historians' debate about how Germany should remember the Holocaust. Habermas forcefully defended the historical singularity of the Holocaust against attempts to relativize it. For him, philosophy was never separate from public life. It had a responsibility to society. So what should universities remember? Habermas represents a kind of academic that universities today should strive to cultivate. He was not concerned with citation metrics. He was not driven by research grant capture. He was not building a career around teaching scores or institutional dashboards. He was something else. What was he? He was bold, original, creative, compassionate, and forcefully intellectual. He believed that scholars had a duty to illuminate the structures of power shaping society. In an era when universities themselves increasingly resemble bureaucratic systems, Habermas reminds us what the intellectual vocation can still be. Habermas often described democracy as a conversation. Not a perfect conversation, but power relations always exist, as do their distortions. Inequality always exists. Identity always exists. But democracy depends upon our willingness to keep speaking and to keep listening. In that sense, Habermas's philosophy was never meant to be finished. He invites each generation to renew the practice of critical dialogue. As educators, scholars, and citizens, that responsibility now belongs to us. Jürgen Habermas his life defending the idea that human beings can still speak to each other as equals. That idea may be fragile, but it remains one of the most important hopes we have. Before finishing, I want to add one final reflection. Habermas spent much of his life warning that modern societies risk allowing systems of administration, markets and bureaucracies to colonize the life world, the everyday space human beings speak, learn and understand each other. Today, we face a new version of that problem. Increasingly, our communication is mediated by digital platforms, algorithms and artificial intelligence. These systems shape what we see, what we read, and sometimes even what we believe. The danger is not simply technological, it is philosophical. When communication itself becomes structured by invisible systems of optimization and prediction, the possibility of genuine dialogue can begin to erode. In that sense, Habermas's work may be more important now than ever before, because the question he asked remains the same. Can human beings continue to speak to each other as free and equal participants in a shared world? The question will not disappear with his. If anything, it becomes more urgent, and perhaps the best way to honour Habermas is simply this: to keep the conversation going and to hold the future open. Thank you for listening. My name's Alex McTaggart. Please like and subscribe, and have a great week.